The frozen moon of Catherine 7 hung in the shadow of a massive gas giant, and the mining colony that clung to its surface had known only one law for 30 years. The strong take what they want, and the weak learn to survive on what remains. The Varax had established this law on the day they arrived, and no species had ever challenged it since then. They stood 7 feet tall with scales, like dark armor and eyes that glowed with infrared heat vision. And when they walked through the corridors of the outpost, every other creature pressed against the walls to let them pass. Kesrith, the Unbroken, was their leader, and he had earned his title through countless dominance battles that left his rivals scarred and submissive. He ruled the colony not through official authority, but through biological supremacy, through the simple and ancient truth that predators command and prey obeys. The other species had accepted this arrangement because they had no choice, because their bodies betrayed them whenever a Varax drew near. The insectoid Cheller would freeze in place, their compound eyes locked on the predator, their mandibles clicking in instinctive terror. The amphibious Mora would drop their gaze and hunch their shoulders, making themselves small and unthreatening. Even the massive silicon-based Kreth, who feared nothing else in the galaxy, would step aside when Kesrith approached. This was the natural order of Outpost Catherine 7, and everyone believed it would last forever. Then the transport ship arrived with a new environmental systems specialist, and everything began to change. Dr. Elena Vance stepped off the shuttle and into the freezing air of the docking bay, and she looked around with calm curiosity at the alien faces watching Hirsch. He was small by galactic standards, standing barely 5.5 feet tall with soft brown skin and dark hair pulled back from her face. She had no claws, no fangs, no armor, no venom, and no natural weapons of any kind. The Mora supervisor who greeted her felt a wave of pity wash through his chest, because this fragile creature had no idea what kind of place she had come to. "Welcome to Catherine 7, Tadala said in his bubbling voice, "and I hope you will find your quarters acceptable. Though I must warn you that resources here are distributed according to certain traditions." Elena smiled at him, and Tadala's felt a strange flutter of confusion at the expression. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, "and I look forward to working with everyone here." Word spread quickly through the colony that a human had arrived, and most species had never seen one before. They gathered in doorways and around corners to catch a glimpse of her as Tadalis led her through the corridors, and they whispered to each other in a dozen different languages. "She has no scales," clicked the Chalier engineer, "and no protective shell of any kind. Her eyes face forward like a predator," bubbled a young Mora, "but she moves like prey, soft and slow and vulnerable. Perhaps her species has powerful technology," rumbled a Kreth philosopher. "Or perhaps she is simply foolish to come here." The whispers reached the Varax quarters within the hour, and Kesrith listened with mild interest as his subordinate described the new arrival. "She is nothing," Kesrith decided, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the metal floor. "And she will learn her place soon enough." He found her in the mess hall that evening, sitting alone at a table near the environmental controls she had come to maintain. The room was crowded with workers from a dozen species, all of them eating their allocated rations and speaking in quiet voices. When Kesrith entered, silence fell like a hammer blow. Every head turned toward the floor, every conversation died, and the only sound was the soft hum of the air recyclers. Elena looked up from her meal and watched the massive predator approach, and she did not look away. Kesrith felt a flicker of surprise at her steady gaze, but he dismissed it as ignorance, as the foolishness of a creature who did not yet understand the rules. He stopped directly in front of her table and loomed over her, his shadow swallowing her small form. Then he performed his threat display. His neck frills flared wide, revealing bright patterns of red and orange that signaled deadly intent. His jaws opened to expose rows of serrated teeth designed for tearing flesh. A low growl rolled from his chest, pitched at a frequency that triggered panic responses in nearly every carbon-based life form. The other colonists trembled where they sat. Unable to move, unable to look away from the terrible spectacle, Elena sat very still. And her heart beat faster in her chest, and adrenaline flooded her system in response to the obvious threat. But her face did not change. She did not scream or cry or beg for mercy. And she did not drop her gaze or hunch her shoulders in submission. She simply watched the display with what appeared to be calm attention, as if Kesrath were showing her an interesting piece of equipment rather than threatening her. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. Then 10, then 20. Kesrath had never encountered a creature that did not react to his display. And he found himself uncertain how to proceed. He had expected fear, craved it, needed it to complete the ritual of dominance. Instead, he received nothing. Just steady eyes and a soft face that showed no emotion. He could read finally. He closed his jaws and folded his frills back against his neck. And he stepped away from her table without a word. Elena picked up her eating utensil and returned to her meal. And she did not watch him leave. The colonists remained frozen in shock, their minds struggling to process what they had witnessed. The human had not submitted, but she had not challenged either. And Kesrath had withdrawn without establishing clear dominance. What does it mean? A Shalier whispered to her companion. No one had an answering his quarters that night. Kesrath lay awake on his heated platform and thought about the human for the first time. She was nothing, he told himself again. Just a small, soft creature with no power and no importance. But somewhere in the back of his ancient predator brain, a tiny alarm had begun to sound, warning him of something he could not name, something he had never faced before. He dismissed the feeling and closed his eyes. Confident that the human would learn her place eventually, he was wrong, and the proof would come sooner than anyone expected. 3 weeks passed on Outpost Catherine 7, and Elena Vance became part of the colony's daily rhythm without causing any further disturbance. She worked long hours in the Environmental Control Center, adjusting the heating systems and oxygen recyclers that kept everyone alive in the frozen wasteland outside. The Shalier engineers grew comfortable with her presence, clicking their mandibles in greeting when she passed them in the corridors. The Mora scientists invited her to share meals with them, and they were surprised to discover that she asked questions about their culture and listened carefully to their answers. She learned the names of dozens of colonists, and she remembered small details about their lives. And she treated everyone with the same quiet respect regardless of their species or status. But the Varax noticed something troubling about the human, something that made them uneasy in ways they could not explain. She did not behave correctly when a Varax warrior snarled at her in the corridor. Her pupils did not expand with fear when they raised their frills in warning. Her breathing did not quicken when they growled at frequencies designed to trigger panic. Her hands did not tremble, and her voice did not shake. She simply stepped aside with a polite nod and continued on her way, as if they were minor obstacles rather than apex predators demanding submission. The Varax read dominance through subtle, biological signals that other species could not control. The dilation of pupils, the spike in body temperature, the chemical signatures of fear that leaked from pores and glands. Elena produced none of these signals, and her face moved in ways that conveyed nothing they could interpret. When she was amused, the corners of her mouth curved upward and her eyes crinkled. But there was no corresponding sense of submission when she was thinking hard about a problem. Her brow furrowed and her lips pressed together. But there was no elevation in her heart rate. She was a blank page written in a language they had never learned to read. And this bothered them more than they wanted to admit. Kareth began watching the human from a distance, studying her movements and expressions as she went about her daily routine. He told himself he was simply being cautious, that any good leader should understand all the creatures under his dominion. But the truth was more complicated than that. In 30 years of absolute power, Kasrath had never encountered a being he could not predict his survival instincts were finely tuned to read the intentions of others, to spot weakness and exploit it, to identify threats before they became dangerous. With Elena, those instincts produced only static, only confusion, only an uncomfortable void where understanding should be. He observed her one morning as she helped a young Mora worker repair a broken heating conduit. The Mora was nervous, fumbling with the tools, clearly terrified of making a mistake in front of the strange human. Elena put a hand on his shoulder and spoke to him in a soft voice, and the Mora's trembling slowly subsided. Then she smiled at him, baring her small blunt teeth in an expression that radiated warmth and encouragement. The Mora relaxed completely, his fear dissolving as if it had never existed. Kasrath felt his neck frills twitch involuntarily at the sight. In Varak's culture, bared teeth meant only one thing: aggression, the preparation for violence, the promise of pain. But Elena showed her teeth constantly, to friends and strangers alike, and no one seemed alarmed by it. The Chelier received her smiles with pleased clicks of their mandibles. The Claire received her smiles with pleased clicks of their mandibles. Mora responded with their own species-specific gestures of friendship even. The stoic Kreth had begun nodding their massive heads when she greeted them. It was as if the human was displaying weapons while simultaneously projecting peace. And everyone except the Varak seemed to understand the contradiction. Crash consulted with his most trusted advisor, an older warrior named Threll, who had studied many species during her long life. What do you see when she shows her teeth? Kasrath demanded. Thrall considered the question carefully before answering. I see a predator displaying its killing tools, she said slowly. But the rest of her body says she intends no harm. And the two messages cancel each other in my mind. How can that be? Kasrath growled. I do not know, Thrall admitted. And that troubles me, because we have always been able to read our prey. And a prey we cannot read is a prey we cannot control. Kasrath dismissed her with a wave of his clawed hand. But her words echoed in his thoughts for the rest of the day. That evening, he arranged to cross paths with Elena in the corridor outside the mess hall. She saw him approaching and did not change direction, did not speed up or slow down, did not show any of the avoidance behaviors he expected when they stood face to face. He performed a moderate threat display. Not his full intimidation ritual, but enough to make any normal creature flinch. Elena tilted her head slightly and looked at him with an expression he could not decipher. Good evening, Kasrath, she said in a pleasant voice, and I hope your day went well. She smiled at him, and he felt his internal temperature spike with frustration. You do not fear me, he stated, making it sound like an accusation. I respect you, Elena replied calmly. But fear is not the same as respect, and I have found that respect lasts longer. She stepped around him and continued toward her quarters. Leaving him standing alone in the corridor, Kasrath remained motionless for a long moment, his mind churning with unfamiliar emotions. He was not used to being answered so directly, so calmly, so completely without deference. The other species trembled when he spoke to them, and their fear fed his sense of power and rightness. But Elena had looked him in the eye and spoken as if they were equals. And the worst part was that he had not known how to respond. Seed of doubt that had been planted in the mess hall 3 weeks ago had begun to grow, and Kasrath could feel it spreading through his thoughts like a crack in thick ice. He was still the strongest creature on Kethrin 7, still the apex predator that everyone else feared, but for the first time in his life, he had met something he could not dominate through strength alone, something that existed outside the rules he understood, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a question formed that he could not answer. What do you do with a creature that refuses to be prey? The answer would come soon, and it would change everything he believed about power and fear and the natural order of the universe. The central refinery chamber was the heart of Outpost Kethrin 7. a massive circular room where the colony's power was distributed and resources were allocated. Representatives from all 12 species gathered there once a week to discuss their needs and receive their assignments. And everyone understood that the Vorax always spoke first and took what they wanted to Dallas. The Mora supervisor stood before the assembly with his head bowed and his webbed hands clasped in front of him. He had come to make a request, and he knew it would not go well. "The spawning season approaches," he said in his bubbling voice, "and our young require warmer temperatures to survive. And I humbly ask that additional heating be allocated to the Mora residential section." Keshrath rose from his elevated seat and descended toward the amphibian with slow, deliberate steps. The other colonists watched in silence, their bodies tense with anticipated fear. "You asked for additional resources," Keshrath said, his voice a deep rumble that echoed off the metal walls. "But the heating allocation has already been decided, and the Vorax require consistent temperatures for our metabolic functions." Daedalus lowered himself even further, his body almost touching the floor. "I understand," he whispered, "and I apologize for my foolish request." "You should apologize," Keshrath agreed, looming over the trembling amphibian, "because you forget your place. And you forget that the strong determine how resources are used." He flared his neck frills and bared his fangs. And Daedalus collapsed completely, his body pressed flat against the cold metal floor in total submission. The other Mara looked away, unable to watch their leader be humiliated. The Chelier clicked nervously among themselves. The crests stood like silent statues, their crystalline faces revealing nothing, and Elena Vance watched from the back of the chamber with an expression that shifted slowly from neutral to something else. Entirely, she had seen many things during her weeks on the station, and witnessed the casual cruelty of the Vorax and the constant fear of the other species. She had stayed quiet and observed, learning the rhythms and rules of this place, trying to understand how things worked. But something about this moment struck her differently. Something about the sight of Daedalus pressed against the floor while his people looked away in shame. She thought about the young Mora she had helped with the heating conduit, about his nervous hands and his gradual trust. She thought about the spawning pool she had seen in the Mora section, and the anxious parents waiting for the warmth their children needed. She thought about what it meant to live your entire life in fear, never daring to ask for what you needed, never believing you deserved basic dignity. And something in her shifted, something quiet and powerful that had been waiting for the right moment. She stepped forward, and her footsteps echoed in the silent chamber. Every eye turned toward her, every breath caught in a dozen throats. Keshrath turned away from the prostrate Mora and focused his infrared gaze on the approaching human. He expected her to speak on behalf of Daedalus, to make some weak argument about fairness or compassion that he could easily crush instead. Elena stopped a few feet away from him and looked directly into his glowing eyes, and she smiled. It was not a nervous smile or a submissive gesture or a plea for mercy. It was a wide, genuine smile that lit up her entire face, that crinkled the corners of her eyes and showed every one of her small, blunt teeth. She smiled at him the way she smiled at friends, the way she smiled at the Mora workers she had helped, the way humans smile when they feel warmth and confidence and absolute calm. Keshrath felt his body lock in place. His instincts screamed contradictory warnings that crashed against each other in his brain-bared teeth. Meant aggression, meant an imminent attack, meant a predator preparing to strike. But there was no elevated heartbeat, no spike in body temperature, no chemical signature of adrenaline or anger. Her body was relaxed, her posture open, her breathing slow and steady. She was displaying weapons while projecting complete peace. And his ancient predator brain could not resolve the paradox for 3 full seconds. The apex predator of Catherine 7 did nothing. He did not advance to meet the perceived threat. He did not retreat from the confusing signals. he simply froze, caught between responses that canceled each other out, his threat display forgotten. His dominance ritual interrupted. The colonists stared in disbelief at the impossible scene. They had never seen Kesrith hesitate, had never imagined that anything could make him pause, had never conceived of a moment when the predator looked uncertain. Elena let the silence stretch for another heartbeat, then spoke in a soft, calm voice. Daedalus needs the heat, and I think you know that. She turned and walked toward the chamber exit, still smiling, still radiating that impossible calm. Kesrith did not stop her. He did not move at all until she had disappeared through the doorway. And even then his movements were slow and confused. Daedalus lifted his head from the floor and looked at the Varax leader with wonder in his large, wet eyes. The other colonists began to whisper, their voices rising like a tide. Did you see that? Clicked the Shellier engineer. She smiled at him, bubbled a Mora scientist. And he stopped. The predator hesitated, rumbled a Kreth philosopher. And hesitation is the first crack in absolute power. Kesrith heard the whispers and felt something cold settle in his chest. He had shown uncertainty in front of the entire colony, had revealed that something could make him pause, had demonstrated that his dominance was not as absolute as everyone believed. He turned and strode from the chamber, without another word, his subordinates following in confused silence. But the damage was already done, and everyone who had witnessed the moment understood that something fundamental had changed. Single human smile had accomplished what 30 years of submission could not. It had made the apex predator doubt himself, and in a society built on fear, doubt was the most dangerous weapon of all. The story spread through Outpost Catherine 7 like fire through dry grass, racing from corridor to corridor and section to section, until every creature on the station had heard some version of the events in the refinery chamber. The details changed slightly with each telling, but the core remained the same. The human had smiled at Kesrith, and the great predator had frozen in. Place workers whispered about it in the mining tunnels, and engineers discussed it in the maintenance bays, and scientists analyzed it in their laboratories for the first time in 30 years. They had something new to talk about, something that challenged everything they believed about power and fear and the natural order of their small frozen world. The Shellier were the first to act on what they had witnessed there. Hive mind worked through the implications with cold logical efficiency, and they reached a simple conclusion. If a predator could be confused, then a predator could be outmaneuvered. 3 days after the incident, a Varax warrior approached the secondary tool storage to claim a power drill that the Shellier were using. Give me that equipment, the warrior demanded, his frills half raised in casual dominance. The Shellier engineer looked at him with her compound eyes and did not immediately surrender the tool. There is an inventory discrepancy, she said, her mandibles clicking at a tone that might have been nervousness or might have been something else entirely. And I must verify the allocation records before releasing any equipment. The warrior blinked in surprise, because no Shellier had ever made him wait for anything. I said, give it to me, he repeated, raising his frills higher. The records must be verified, the engineer replied, and the process will take approximately 2 hours. She turned back to her work as if the conversation was over, and the warrior stood there in confusion for a long moment before walking away empty-handed. Told himself he would return later when the paperwork was sorted out, that he had more important things to do than argue with insects. But both of them knew something had shifted, something small but significant. The Mora moved next. Emboldened by the Kalir's quiet resistance, Daedalus filed a formal complaint through official Galactic Union channels, requesting an investigation into resource allocation practices on Catherine 7. It was a bureaucratic action, slow and uncertain, but it was also unprecedented. No species had ever appealed to outside authority over the Varax. because everyone assumed the Varax would punish such defiance brutally, but the punishment did not come. And the silence spoke louder than any threat. Kesroth heard about the complaint and felt his anger rise like heat from a furnace. But he hesitated to act. If he crushed Tadalis now, it would look like desperation. Like he was trying to silence criticism because he could not answer it, and worse, it might draw more attention from the Galactic Union, whose officials had always accepted the Varax dominance as natural, but might look more closely if given a reason for the first time in his life. Kesroth found himself calculating political consequences. Instead of simply asserting his will, the change did not suit him, and he resented the human for forcing him into this unfamiliar territory on the 5th day after the incident. The Kreth approached Elena in her quarters. They moved silently despite their massive size, and she looked up from her work to find 3 crystalline figures standing in her doorway. "May we speak with you?" their leader asked, his voice like stones grinding together. Elena invited them in and offered them seats, though the Kreth preferred to stand. "We have observed the recent events," the leader said, "and we have a question for you. What did you do to Kesroth?" Elena considered her answer carefully before speaking. "I smiled at him," she said simply. "We understand that," the Kreth replied, "but we do not understand why it affected him so strongly, and we wish to know the mechanism behind your action." Elena leaned back in her chair and thought about how to explain something that humans took for granted. "My species evolved on a world that tried very hard to kill us," she began. "And we survived not because we were the strongest or the fastest, but because we learned to work together and because we learned to hide what we were feeling." The Kreth listened in silence, their faceted eyes gleaming with interest. "On my world, the creatures with the biggest teeth and the sharpest claws were often the prey of creatures like us, because we could plan and cooperate and wait for the right moment to strike. And we could do all of this while appearing calm and unthreatening." She paused to let them absorb this information. "The smile is part of that heritage, and it means different things in different contexts. But at its core, it is a display of confidence and connection. And it uses the same muscles that other species use to show aggression. So when you showed your teeth to Kesroth," the Kreth leader said slowly, "you sent him signals of both peace and threat at the same time." "Yes," Elena confirmed. And his instincts could not decide which signal to believe. And so he froze. The Kreth exchanged glances with each other, communicating in ways that Elena could not perceive. "You have given him a problem he cannot solve," the leader finally said, "because you exist outside the framework he uses to understand the universe. Everyone exists outside that framework," Elena replied gently. "And the Varax have simply convinced you all to pretend otherwise. But fear only works on creatures who believe they have something to lose." She smiled at them, and the Kreth did not flinch. "You have already lost everything under their system," she continued. "And the only thing left is hope, and you cannot threaten hope away." The Kreth departed without another word, but Elena knew she had planted a seed in their crystalline minds. Meanwhile, Kesroth attempted to reassert his dominance through escalating displays of aggression. He patrolled the corridors more frequently, snarled at workers who did not move fast enough, and performed elaborate threat rituals at every opportunity. But doubt had infected even his own subordinates, and they had seen him hesitate when he ordered them to punish the Shalier for their paperwork delays. They obeyed slowly and without enthusiasm when he demanded that they intimidate the Mora scientists. They went through the motions but produced no real terror. The fear that had fueled Varax's power for 30 years was evaporating, like water in the recycled air. And Kesroth could feel his grip on the colony slipping with each passing day. On the 7th day, he made his decision. He would confront the human directly, publicly, and finally establish his dominance beyond any doubt. He would show the colony that one moment of hesitation meant nothing, that the Varax were still the apex predators, That fear was still the only law that mattered. He sent word throughout the station that all species would gather in the council chamber. The next morning, to witness a formal dominance ritual, the human would attend, whether she wanted to or not, and this time, Kesrith swore to himself. There would be no confusion and no hesitation. This time, he would remind everyone why they had feared him for 30 years, but even as he made these promises, a small voice in the back of his mind wondered if the human would smile at him again, and what he would do if she did. The council chamber filled slowly as representatives from all 12 species took their assigned places around the curved walls. The Shalier clustered together near the engineering section, their compound eyes tracking every movement in the room. The Mora huddled in the dampest corner, their gills fluttering with nervous energy. The Kreth stood like ancient monuments along the back wall, their crystalline faces impossible to read, and in the center of the room, on his elevated platform, Kesrith waited with his subordinates arrayed behind him like an army. The air crackled with tension that every creature could feel, a sense that something important was about to happen, that the colony would be different after this day, regardless of how events unfolded. When Elena walked through the entrance, alone and unarmed and calm, every eye turned to watch her progress across the metal floor. She wore her standard work uniform and carried nothing in her hands, and she moved with the same quiet confidence she had shown since the day she arrived. She stopped in the open space before Kesrith's platform and looked up at him without any trace of fear. "You wanted to see me," she said, and her voice carried easily through the silent chamber. Kesrith descended from his platform with slow, deliberate steps, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat. He stopped an arm's length from Elena and towered over her, his shadow swallowing her small form. "You have caused disruption in my colony," he announced, his voice pitched to reach every corner of the room. "And you have confused my subordinates with your strange behaviors. And you have undermined the natural order that has kept everyone safe for 30 years. Elena tilted her head slightly but did not step back. "I have done nothing but my job and treated everyone with basic respect," she replied calmly. "Respect is earned through strength." Kesrith growled, "And you have no strength. And yet you behave as if you are my equal." He raised his frills to their full extension and opened his jaws wide, displaying every one of his serrated teeth. A subsonic growl rolled from his chest, vibrating through the floor and into the bones of every creature present. It was his most elaborate threat display, more intense than anything he had performed in years, designed to overwhelm and terrify and force absolute submission. The colonists trembled where they stood, their bodies responding involuntarily to 30 years of conditioned fear. But Elena did not tremble, and she did not drop her gaze, and she did not hunch her shoulders or make herself small. She watched his display with the same calm attention she had shown on her first day. And when he finally paused for breath, she did something unexpected. She laughed. It was a short, warm sound, genuine amusement bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her. "You are beautiful when you are angry," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "But I am not your enemy, Kesrith. And I never was." The Varax leader felt his display falter as confusion swept through him again. No creature had ever called him beautiful, and no creature had ever laughed at his threat ritual, and no creature had ever claimed to be anything other than either his subject or his enemy. "You are prey," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I am neither prey nor predator," Elena replied. "And that is what confuses you, because your entire understanding of the universe is built on that division. But humans do not fit into your categories." She took a step toward him, and the gesture was so unexpected that he stepped back. The colonists gasped at the sight, at the apex predator retreating from the soft, unarmed human. "My species evolved as persistence hunters," Elena continued, taking another step forward, and we did not chase our prey with speed or overwhelm them with strength. But we followed them for hours and days until they collapsed from exhaustion. And we did this while staying calm and patient and showing nothing on our faces. Another step. And Kasrath retreated again. We learned to mask our fear because showing fear attracted predators. And we learned to mask our aggression because showing aggression warned our prey. And we learned to smile at each other because cooperation was our greatest weapon. She stopped directly in front of him. Close enough to touch. You rule through fear because that is what worked for your species. And I understand that, and I do not blame you for it. But fear only works on creatures who believe they have something to lose. She gestured at the assembled colonists with one hand. Look at them, Kasrath, and really see them, and ask yourself what they have left to lose under your system. Because the answer is nothing. The Varax leader looked at the trembling masses around the room. And for the first time, he saw something. Besides prey, he saw the Shellier engineers who kept a station running despite receiving the worst rations. He saw the Mora. Scientists who had made breakthrough discoveries in harsh conditions without recognition. He saw the Kreth. Philosophers who had watched in silence for 30 years, waiting for something to change. He saw creatures who had survived despite his oppression. Not because of it. They have already lost everything, Elena said softly. And the only thing left is hope, and you cannot threaten hope away. But you can give them something better. She extended her hand toward him. Palm open, fingers relaxed. Work with us instead, she said. And share the resources fairly, and let the council actually function as it was meant to. And you will still be the strongest creature on this station. Her smile returned, warm and genuine. But you will be respected instead of feared, and respect lasts longer than fear. Because fear only survives as long as you can maintain the threat. But respect survives even when you are weak. Kesra stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment. Every instinct he possessed screamed that it was a trap. That showing any softness would be the end of his power. That predators could not afford to make peace with prey. But another part of him, the part that had evolved to solve problems and adapt to new situations, recognized the truth in her words. His system was failing, and everyone knew it. And crushing the human would not restore the fear that had already begun to evaporate. He could fight the change and lose slowly. Or he could embrace it and perhaps find something new slowly, painfully. The apex predator of Catherine 7 reached out and took Elena's hand. The chamber erupted in noise. A dozen species all reacting at once. But the sound was not fear or submission. It was something closer to hope. 3 months later, Outpost Catherine 7 became a model for multi-species. Cooperation resources were allocated. Through negotiation rather than intimidation disputes. Were resolved through mediation rather than domination. The Mora spawning pools received adequate heating, and the Shellier engineers were recognized for their contributions. And the Kreth philosophers began sharing their wisdom with anyone who would listen. Kasrath remained on the colony council. His strength, now protecting the community rather than controlling eyes, never fully understood humans, and he probably never would. But he had learned to respect them when new species arrived at the station and asked how peace had been achieved. The colonists always told the same story. A single human smiled. They said, and everything changed and across the galaxy. The legend spread through trade routes and diplomatic channels and whispered. Conversations in dark corners. Beware the species that shows its teeth in friendship. The legend warned, because they have already won wars you cannot see. Beware the creatures from the death world called Earth. Because they smile when they should flee and laugh when they should fear. Beware the humans. Because they do not fit into your categories. And a creature without a category is a creature you cannot predict. And a creature you cannot predict might just change everything you believe. about power and fear and the natural order of the universe. Elena Vance continued her work on the environmental systems, and she smiled at everyone she met, and she never realized that she had become a legend, but Kesrith knew. And sometimes late at night when the station was quiet, he would find her in the mess hall and sit across from her and try to understand. "Why did you do it?" he asked her once. Near the end of her assignment, Elena looked at him with warm eyes and smiled her impossible smile. "Because you deserved better than fear," she said. And so did everyone else. And sometimes all it takes to change the world is one person willing to stand still and smile. Kesrith considered this for a long moment, then did something he had never done before. He smiled back, his serrated teeth gleaming in the artificial light, his furls relaxed against his neck. It was awkward and unfamiliar, and probably terrifying to anyone who did not know the context, but Elena understood. And she laughed, and somewhere in the frozen darkness outside, the universe shifted just a little bit toward hope.